The night was silent, the kind of silence that settled heavily across the fields. Only the rustling of dry leaves carried by the wind broke the stillness. Ethan, the farmer, stood at a distance, watching as his horse, Ranger, made his way toward the northern hill. Every night at the same hour, the horse slipped out of the corral and followed an overgrown trail leading to an abandoned cave. This strange behavior had been going on for weeks. Ranger moved with a calm purpose, as if drawn by an invisible force, and it unnerved Ethan more than he wanted to admit. That night, Ethan decided it was time to uncover the truth. Grabbing a flashlight and slipping on his worn coat, he waited until Ranger began his nightly journey. Then, keeping a safe distance, Ethan quietly followed. The path to the cave was longer than he remembered. The gnarled branches of nearby trees cast eerie shadows, twisting like ghostly figures under the beam of his flashlight. The damp earth smelled rich and heavy, and every step made the dry leaves crunch ominously under his boots. When he reached the mouth of the cave, Ethan hesitated. The entrance loomed in front of him like a gaping maw, swallowing all light and sound. Ranger stood at the edge of the darkness, calm and unbothered, as if awaiting some unspoken signal. Without a second thought, the horse stepped into the cave. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath forming a faint mist in the cold night air. "What are you looking for in there, boy?" he muttered under his breath before reluctantly stepping inside. The cave's interior was cold and damp. The walls gleamed faintly under the weak beam of his flashlight, but beyond that, there was only suffocating darkness. As Ethan moved deeper, he noticed hoofprints embedded in the wet dirt. Ranger had clearly made this journey many times before. An oppressive silence filled the space, broken only by the soft echoes of Ranger's steps. Then, out of nowhere, a faint sound reached Ethan's ears, a low, mournful noise, almost like a distant moan. He froze in place, straining to listen. A chill ran down his spine. The strange sound echoed faintly, growing louder as he moved forward. It seemed to come from the cave walls themselves, bouncing off the jagged rock surfaces in a way that disoriented him. Despite the eerie noise, Ranger remained unfazed, continuing his steady pace as if on a mission. Ethan quickened his steps to keep up, following the horse until they entered a larger chamber. The space opened up with a high ceiling, where cracks in the rocky dome allowed faint moonlight to filter through. Ranger stopped abruptly in the center of the room, staring at something on the ground. Ethan approached cautiously, his pulse quickening. He raised the flashlight to where Ranger's gaze was fixed, and his eyes widened in shock. What lay before him was beyond anything he could have expected, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as the flashlight beam illuminated the ground in front of Ranger. At first, he wasn't sure what he was seeing. It looked like an old stone carving, partially buried in the dirt, with strange, swirling patterns etched into its surface. The shapes were intricate, unlike anything Ethan had ever encountered. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it some kind of ancient marker? A forgotten artifact? The cave had always been part of the land, but no one had ever mentioned anything like this before. Ranger remained still, his ears twitching slightly as though he were listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. The strange moaning sound from earlier had disappeared, leaving only the hollow echoes of their movements. Ethan knelt by the stone, brushing away more dirt and debris. The carvings extended further than he expected, forming a circular design that seemed almost deliberate. "What the hell is this?" he whispered to himself, glancing back at Ranger, who continued to stare down at the stone. As Ethan examined the markings, memories of stories from his grandfather resurfaced. Decades ago, his grandfather had warned him about the northern hills, claiming that certain places were best left alone. Ethan had always dismissed those tales as old folklore designed to scare children. But now, standing in the eerie silence of the cave, those warnings felt uncomfortably real. He shook his head, trying to push away the creeping fear. He wasn't here to chase ghost stories. Something tangible was happening with Ranger, and he needed to focus on that. He stood up and shined the flashlight deeper into the chamber. More paths branched off in multiple directions, each one vanishing into darkness. The idea of exploring those tunnels alone filled him with a sense of dread. Yet there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Something was pulling Ranger here, night after night, and this stone formation was likely connected to it. He decided to take a few pictures with his phone to examine later. Just as he finished, Ranger suddenly let out a low, uneasy whinny, breaking the heavy silence. Ethan turned sharply, his pulse quickening. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice echoing faintly. Ranger's ears were pinned back, and his body tensed as he backed away from the stone circle. Ethan swept the flashlight across the chamber but saw nothing unusual. Yet Ranger's behavior was unmistakable. He sensed something. A cold gust of air seemed to rise from one of the side tunnels, sending another shiver down Ethan's spine. It was colder than the rest of the cave, almost unnaturally so. Reluctantly, Ethan took a step toward the tunnel entrance. The air felt heavier here, as if the darkness itself were pressing in on him. Ranger, however, refused to follow, pawing nervously at the ground. All right, Ethan muttered, lowering the flashlight. He couldn't push the horse any further tonight. They would return, but not before Ethan had time to gather his thoughts, and perhaps some answers. For now, it was time to get out of the cave and back to the safety of the farm. Yet, as they exited the cavern, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly alone in that place. The next morning, Ethan couldn't get the cave out of his mind. He sat on the farmhouse porch, sipping his coffee as the early sunlight stretched across the fields. Ranger grazed near the barn, appearing calm and indifferent as if the events of the previous night had never happened. Ethan stared out at the northern hills, his thoughts clouded by the image of the strange carvings. What did they mean? Could there be more hidden deep inside the cave? He needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. Old Henry, a local historian and a lifelong resident of the area, was known for his knowledge of local legends and hidden histories. Ethan hadn't spoken to him in years, but if anyone could shed light on the mystery, it was Henry. After finishing his coffee, Ethan drove his pickup to the edge of town, where Henry lived in a small, weathered house surrounded by overgrown gardens. The older man greeted him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Haven't seen you around in a while, Ethan. What brings you here?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain everything without sounding ridiculous. "I found something unusual out on my property," he finally said. "Up in one of the caves in the northern hills. It looks like an old stone carving or marker. I thought you might know something about it." Henry's expression darkened at the mention of the northern hills. He motioned for Ethan to follow him inside, where the walls were lined with dusty books and faded photographs of the local landscape. "The northern hills have always been peculiar," Henry said as he poured 2 cups of tea. "A lot of folks won't go near those caves. Some say they're cursed. Others think it's just old stories meant to keep kids away. But there's a history there. Older than this town, older than any of us." Ethan leaned forward, listening intently as Henry continued. "There are tales of ancient symbols carved by settlers or even by tribes before them. Some say the symbols marked sacred ground or warned of things that shouldn't be disturbed." Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine. "I don't believe in curses or sacred warnings," he said, trying to sound confident. "But my horse, Ranger, he's been going to that cave every night. And last night, something didn't feel right. There was this cold air, and he got spooked. He wouldn't go any further." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "Animals can sense things we can't," he said. "They're more in tune with the land. If Ranger's being drawn there, it's not random. Something is calling him." Those words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ethan wasn't ready to believe that the land itself was pulling his horse into the cave, but he couldn't deny the eerie events. "Is there anything else you can tell me? Anything about these symbols or the history of that area?" he asked. Henry stood and began rummaging through an old wooden cabinet. After a few moments, he pulled out a worn map of the region. "This might help," he said, pointing to a series of markings near the hills. "Some of these caves connect through underground tunnels, and there are stories about people who disappeared while exploring them." Ethan studied the map carefully, his mind racing with possibilities. He thanked Henry and left, determined to return to the cave that night. He had to uncover the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be. Yet deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far bigger and far darker than he had anticipated. As twilight descended, Ethan found himself standing once again at the entrance of the cave. The evening air was colder than usual, and the sky above was a deep shade of violet. Ranger stood beside him, restless but compliant. The horse snorted softly, pawing the ground as if warning Ethan one last time. "Easy, boy," Ethan muttered, patting Ranger's neck. He had come prepared this time. Thicker clothes, a stronger flashlight, and the map Henry had given him folded neatly in his pocket. Tonight, he wasn't leaving without answers. The first few steps inside were eerily familiar. The cold, damp air wrapped around Ethan like a shroud as he retraced his path from the night before. His flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the jagged walls and uneven floor. The faint echoes of his footsteps seemed louder in the silence. Ranger hesitated at the entrance but followed a few paces behind. Ethan could feel the horse's tension growing with every step they took. He glanced back and saw Ranger's ears twitching nervously. When they reached the chamber with the carvings, Ethan knelt once more to inspect them. He ran his fingers over the intricate patterns, trying to decipher their meaning. The swirling shapes seemed almost hypnotic, like they were telling a story just out of reach. As he stood, a sudden gust of cold air rushed through the cave, this time stronger than before. It wasn't natural, Ethan was certain of that now. It was as if the cave itself was breathing. Ranger let out a loud whinny and backed away toward the entrance of the chamber, his hooves clattering against the stone floor. "Calm down, Ranger. It's just the wind," Ethan said, though his voice trembled slightly. Deep down, he knew it wasn't just the wind. Something was shifting in the atmosphere, a presence he couldn't quite explain. He turned toward one of the side tunnels that branched off from the chamber. The air seemed colder in that direction, and the sound of distant whispers reached his ears. It was faint, like murmurs carried on the wind, but it was enough to send a shiver down his spine. He aimed his flashlight toward the tunnel entrance, debating whether to move forward. Ranger refused to follow this time. The horse stood frozen at the edge of the chamber, eyes wide with fear. "Stay here, then," Ethan whispered, more to himself than to the animal. Slowly, he advanced into the tunnel, his flashlight casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. The whispers grew louder, though he couldn't make out any words. It was as if voices from another time were echoing through the stones. His pulse quickened, and his mind raced with questions. Were the stories Henry had mentioned true? Had others really disappeared in these tunnels? As Ethan ventured deeper, the ground became uneven, forcing him to watch his step carefully. The tunnel twisted and turned, disorienting him. He glanced over his shoulder, but the chamber was already out of sight. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the occasional drip of water somewhere in the distance. Ethan took a deep breath to steady his nerves. He was close to something, he could feel it. But whether it was the truth he sought or something far more dangerous, he wasn't sure. All he knew was that turning back was no longer an option. The deeper Ethan ventured into the tunnel, the more surreal his surroundings became. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing with each step. The whispers persisted, growing clearer but still unintelligible. He strained his ears, trying to catch a single word or phrase, but all he could make out was the haunting cadence of overlapping voices. They rose and fell in a rhythm, like a chorus echoing through the stones. The flashlight beam flickered suddenly, casting jagged, shifting shadows that made Ethan's breath hitch. "Not now," he muttered, tapping the light nervously. For a moment, the tunnel plunged into complete darkness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him on all sides. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled with the flashlight. When the beam finally steadied, he took a deep breath to calm himself. The air was colder now, biting at his skin even through his jacket. He scanned the tunnel ahead, noticing strange markings on the walls, similar to the carvings in the chamber. These, however, were cruder, as if made in haste. Ethan traced one with his fingers. It felt rough, almost like claw marks. A distant noise, different from the whispers, caught his attention. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deep within the cave. Ethan froze, holding his breath. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice echoing down the passageway. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and silence engulfed the tunnel once more. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He wasn't alone, but whoever or whatever was with him didn't want to be seen. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and cautiously moved forward, each step echoing ominously. As he rounded a corner, the tunnel opened into another chamber, this one smaller than the first. In the center of the room stood a large stone pillar, covered in more of the strange carvings. Ethan approached it slowly, feeling a strange energy in the air. His mind swam with confusion and unease. Why would anyone have gone through the trouble of carving these symbols in such a remote place? He circled the pillar, noting that some of the symbols resembled ancient pictographs, though their meaning was lost to him. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Ethan stood still, his senses heightened. The oppressive feeling returned, as though he were being watched. He turned quickly, shining the flashlight around the chamber, but saw nothing. "This is insane," he whispered to himself. Yet deep down, he knew that something was here with him. Something old. Something waiting. He thought of Ranger and how the horse had refused to follow him any further. Maybe the animal had been right to be afraid. Ethan took one last look at the stone pillar before stepping back toward the tunnel. But just as he did, a voice, clearer than the whispers, echoed through the chamber. It was a single word, low and drawn out: "Leave." Ethan's blood ran cold. He stumbled backward, heart racing, and nearly dropped the flashlight. The word repeated, louder this time. He didn't wait for a third warning. Turning on his heel, he sprinted back toward the tunnel entrance, the shadows seeming to chase after him. He had found something all right, but it wasn't what he had expected. Ethan's lungs burned as he sprinted through the twisting tunnel. His footsteps echoed loudly, each sound bouncing back at him like a threat. The word, "leave," reverberated in his mind, unsettling and unnatural. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, though when he glanced over his shoulder, the darkness revealed nothing. The walls around him seemed to close in tighter with every turn, and the faint markings on the stone surfaces blurred in the frantic beam of his flashlight. All he could focus on was finding his way back to Ranger and getting out of the cave. When he finally saw the dim light of the larger chamber ahead, Ethan slowed down, gasping for breath. Ranger was still there, shifting nervously near the entrance. The horse's eyes were wide, ears pinned back, and he snorted in agitation as Ethan approached. "We're leaving now," Ethan said firmly, though his voice trembled. He placed a hand on Ranger's neck to calm him, feeling the animal's muscles tense under his touch. Without wasting any more time, Ethan led Ranger toward the exit, casting one last glance over his shoulder at the shadowed tunnel. The silence was oppressive, but he could still feel something watching him. Outside the cave, the cold night air felt strangely comforting. Ethan inhaled deeply, relieved to be free from the suffocating darkness. The stars had emerged, dotting the sky with faint light. Ranger stomped his hooves anxiously, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. Ethan gave him a reassuring pat. "We're safe now," he muttered, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. The cave loomed behind him, dark and silent, but its presence felt heavier than ever. He couldn't escape the feeling that he had crossed a line, that he had seen something he wasn't meant to. Ethan returned to the farmhouse with a growing sense of unease. After settling Ranger back in the barn, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the map Henry had given him. The lines of interconnected tunnels and chambers seemed more ominous now. He thought about the stories Henry had told him earlier, the disappearances, the warnings about the hills. Maybe there was more truth to those tales than he wanted to admit. But what did the carvings mean? And why was Ranger drawn to that place? Questions swirled in his mind, offering no clear answers. Unable to sleep, Ethan made a decision. He needed to confront the truth head-on, but not alone. He would visit Henry again in the morning and tell him everything. There was no way he could ignore what he had experienced. Someone else had to know. But even as he made this resolution, a nagging fear crept into his thoughts. He had heard the warning loud and clear. Leave. Whatever was in that cave wanted him gone. The real question was, would it let him go so easily? Ethan drove into town early the next morning, exhaustion etched across his face. He hadn't slept a minute. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a haunting reel, especially that voice. It had felt personal, almost as if it was directed straight into his soul. As he parked in front of Henry's house, he hesitated for a moment, wondering if the old man would even believe him. He shook off the doubt and stepped out of the truck. This wasn't just a strange story anymore. There was something real happening in those hills. Henry greeted him at the door, his sharp eyes immediately noticing Ethan's worn expression. "You look like hell," Henry remarked, motioning for him to come inside. "Let me guess, something happened last night." Ethan nodded, running a hand through his hair. He quickly recounted everything: the deeper exploration, the carvings, the strange voices, and the warning. Henry listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. When Ethan finished, there was a long pause before the older man finally spoke. "You've stirred something up, Ethan. I'm not sure if that's a good thing." Henry led him to a cluttered bookshelf and pulled out a weathered journal. This belonged to a man named Samuel Gray. He lived in this area over a century ago and was one of the first settlers to document the caves. He wrote about strange occurrences, people hearing voices, seeing figures in the dark. He believed the caves were connected to a series of underground passageways used by ancient tribes, possibly for rituals or burials. "But here's the part that might interest you," Henry said, flipping through the pages until he found a faded sketch. It was an almost identical drawing of the stone pillar Ethan had seen the night before. Ethan stared at the image, his pulse quickening. "This is it. This is what I saw." Henry nodded grimly. Samuel called it the Watcher's Pillar. According to his notes, it was believed to guard something, or someone, buried deep within the caves. He wrote that those who disturbed the area often reported hearing warnings, much like you did. Ethan's mind raced. Could the voice he heard have been some sort of guardian? The idea seemed absurd, yet it aligned with everything he had experienced. "What happened to Samuel?" Ethan asked quietly. Henry sighed. "He vanished. Last seen heading into the caves, just like the others." The gravity of Henry's words sank in. Ethan felt a cold pit form in his stomach. This wasn't just about ancient symbols or folklore anymore. People had disappeared because of whatever force was tied to those caves. "What do I do now?" Ethan asked, his voice subdued. Henry looked at him carefully. "You have two choices. You can stay away from that place for good and hope it leaves you alone. Or, you can go back and find out what it wants." Ethan swallowed hard. He knew which choice he would make. But deep down, he also knew that going back might cost him more than he was willing to sacrifice. Night fell once more as Ethan stood at the entrance of the cave. The chill in the air seemed even sharper than before, biting through his jacket and making him shiver. Ranger was nowhere to be seen this time. Ethan hadn't wanted to risk bringing him back. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, his other hand resting on the map Henry had given him. He knew the risks but couldn't shake the need for answers. Something inside that cave was calling him, and ignoring it would only bring more fear and doubt. The cave greeted him with the same oppressive silence. Ethan's footsteps echoed faintly as he made his way through the familiar tunnel. He moved cautiously, tracing the route he had memorized from the map. The air grew colder and heavier with each step. For the first time, he noticed faint glimmers of light reflecting off the walls, almost like phosphorescent streaks embedded in the stone. Were they always there, or was the cave changing in response to his presence? He shook off the thought and pressed forward, his heart pounding in anticipation. As he approached the chamber with the pillar, the whispers returned, faint but insistent. This time, however, they were clearer, fragmented words that Ethan couldn't fully understand but seemed closer to forming sentences. He stepped into the chamber and paused. The stone pillar stood ominously in the center, just as before. The markings on its surface seemed to shimmer under the flashlight's beam. Ethan walked slowly around it, trying to keep his fear at bay. "I'm here," he said aloud, his voice echoing. "What do you want?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a deep vibration shook the ground beneath his feet. Ethan stumbled backward, barely keeping his balance. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. The carvings on the pillar began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Ethan's breathing quickened as the cold air around him intensified. He could hear the warning voice again, but this time it wasn't commanding him to leave. It was urging him to look deeper, to understand. But understand what? Ethan glanced toward the darker tunnels that branched out from the chamber. The whispers seemed to emanate from those depths, drawing him in like a current pulling him underwater. He hesitated, torn between the primal instinct to flee and the unrelenting curiosity that had brought him here. "You want me to follow, don't you?" he whispered. His own words felt foreign in the eerie stillness. The glowing symbols on the pillar pulsed again, as if in response. Ethan knew he had a choice to make, but this time, he wouldn't leave until he found the truth buried within the darkness. Ethan stood at the mouth of the deepest tunnel, the faint glow from the pillar behind him slowly fading. The whispers urged him forward, weaving in and out of his thoughts like a hypnotic rhythm. His flashlight beam wavered as his hand trembled. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and leave, but he couldn't. Something beyond fear compelled him now, a need to confront whatever force had been calling him for so long. He took a deep breath and stepped into the tunnel, the walls narrowing around him like a constricting throat. The path twisted downward, the air becoming colder and more suffocating. The faint phosphorescent glimmers along the walls were stronger here, illuminating strange new symbols etched into the rock. Ethan paused to inspect them, running his fingers over the worn grooves. Unlike the earlier carvings, these were jagged, almost violent, depicting scenes of figures in anguish and spirals that seemed to represent endless cycles. His mind raced with possibilities. Were these warnings? He shook his head, pushing down the growing dread as he continued forward. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller but more oppressive than the last. In the center was a circular stone platform, surrounded by carvings similar to those on the pillar. The whispers became deafening now, filling the space with chaotic voices that spoke over one another. Ethan clutched his head, overwhelmed by the noise. "Stop!" he shouted. To his shock, the voices quieted instantly, leaving a void of absolute silence. He stood in the center of the platform, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He felt as though the cave itself was watching him, waiting for his next move. A deep, resonant voice suddenly broke the silence. Unlike the chaotic whispers, this voice was steady and commanding. "You have crossed into the boundary of the forgotten," it said. Ethan turned wildly, but saw no one. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I'm not here to cause harm. I just want to understand." The voice did not respond immediately. Instead, the glowing carvings on the platform intensified, casting the entire chamber in an eerie blue light. The air grew colder still, and Ethan shivered uncontrollably. The voice returned, low and deliberate. "You seek what was buried long ago, knowledge that comes at a price. The Guardian watches. The cycles repeat." Ethan frowned, struggling to comprehend the cryptic message. Guardian? Cycles? What did any of it mean? He stepped closer to the center of the platform, feeling a deep vibration beneath his feet. "What cycles? Why is Ranger drawn to this place?" he asked, his voice steady despite his fear. The chamber trembled slightly in response. "The time of revelation nears," the voice said. "Return before the shadows consume you, or face what others have not survived." Ethan knew there would be no more warnings. He had a choice, to walk away forever or face the final truth hidden in the depths of the cave. Ethan stood on the platform, his thoughts racing. The voice's warning echoed in his mind, urging him to leave before it was too late. Yet he couldn't turn back. He had come too far, and the truth, whatever it was, lay just ahead. As if responding to his resolve, the ground rumbled softly, and a hidden tunnel opened at the far end of the chamber. A faint blue glow illuminated the passageway, guiding him forward. Ethan swallowed hard and stepped inside, his flashlight barely cutting through the otherworldly light surrounding him. The tunnel led him to a massive underground hall. Enormous stone structures loomed around him, their surfaces covered with glowing carvings that pulsed rhythmically. In the center stood a colossal statue, humanoid but alien, with a twisted stone mask obscuring its face. Ethan felt a crushing presence emanating from it, as though the very walls were alive and aware of his every movement. The whispers returned, softer now, circling around him like an unseen current. He stepped closer to the statue, each step feeling heavier than the last. Something about this place felt timeless, as though countless others had stood here before him. As he approached the statue, images flooded his mind, visions of people from different eras walking this same path. He saw settlers, explorers, and wanderers, each seeking something they could not find elsewhere. Some vanished into the darkness, consumed by fear or ambition, while others seemed to find peace before fading into the unknown. Ethan realized that the cave was not simply a place of danger, it was a threshold between worlds, where the cycles of fate and time converged. The voice returned, steady and calm. "You have reached the heart of the forgotten. The truth lies not in answers, but in the understanding you carry forward." Ethan touched the statue's surface, and a wave of calm washed over him. The whispers faded into silence, and the glow of the carvings dimmed. For the first time since entering the cave, he felt no fear, only a profound sense of acceptance. This place wasn't meant to be fully understood. It existed as a reminder of the infinite connections between past and present, life and mystery. Slowly, Ethan turned and retraced his steps. When he emerged into the cool night air, Ranger was waiting for him near the cave entrance. Ethan smiled faintly, placing a hand on the horse's neck. Together, they walked back toward the farm. The cave no longer haunted him. Its secret had become a part of him, a quiet truth that needed no further explanation.